Good day, class. So today we'll be discussing the societal impacts the Great Depression had on the U.S. population. So as you know, the Great Depression came upon our nation rather suddenly. The crash occurred over the 3-day span from the 24th to the 29th of October 1929, which left the nation asking many questions. The first to be considered was, what about the banks? Their loans were not being repaid, and their investors were withdrawing huge sums of money. It became clear that citizens could not trust the banks to secure their wealth. And so bank runs occurred, which caused thousands of banks to collapse. By 1932, over 9,000 banks had closed. It became clear soon after these events began to unfold that the ramifications of the crash would be long-lasting and hard-hitting. As you know, the cycle of depression began to unfold when businesses ran out of clients and customers. The populace was attempting to recover from the losses they suffered through the market crash and subsequent bank failures. So by saving money, citizens did not create the demand for products, which resulted in the evaporation of markets. Businesses laid off employees to compensate for the decreased demand, which then resulted in even less demand for product. The cycle became increasingly destructive as the positive feedback loop increased the economic devastation. Between 1929 and 1932, the GDP, the gross domestic product, dropped from $103.1 billion to $58 billion. Consumption of goods dropped by 18%. Construction dropped by 78%. Private investment dropped by 88%. Unemployment rose to 25%, and corporate profits tanked by 90%. 100,000 businesses failed. These statistics are jaw-dropping to say the least, but statistics only tell a part of the story. The human drama of the Great Depression was an entirely distinctive period in United States history, where individuals across all races, classes, and creeds became hard hit by the economic devastation and uncertain of how and when their lives would improve. In both the rural and urban areas of the nation, the Depression hit people hard. On farms, it was very common to find that families could no longer afford their mortgages, and loans were called in, and banks were closed on many, many farms. In fact, in Mississippi, it was reported that in a single day in April, 1/4 of the state's land was auctioned off because of farmer debt. In an effort to forestall and prevent foreclosure, farmers opted to increase their crop yields. This resulted, as you know, in the plummeting of crop prices. In North Dakota, a bushel of wheat cost 77 cents to produce and fetched 33 cents at market. A group of disenfranchised farmers, led by Iowa populist Milo Reno, protested the intolerable circumstances farmers faced by cutting off food supplies to urban areas through blocking roads and destroying milk, vegetables, and other foodstuffs. Milo and his Farmers Holiday Association advocated that farmers take a holiday and not plant or harvest crops so that their prices might rise. Between 1930 and 1934, nearly 1 million farmers, in fact, failed to pay their mortgages and lost their farms. 1 million. In Harlan County, Kentucky, coal miners striked for a 10% wage cut in 1931. The National Guard was called in to crush that union strike. In West Virginia and Kentucky, hunger was so widespread and resources so limited that the American Friends Service, which was tasked with managing food relief efforts in that region, distributed food only to those who were 10% below their normal weight for their height. The Great Depression actually reversed the process of urbanization as city dwellers began moving into the country to escape the uncertainty and grow their own food there. In fact, by 1935, 33 million people lived on farms, which was more than any other time in U.S. history. In cities, people fared no better. Hungry men and women lined up every day at soup kitchens. 4,000 children stood in bread lines every day in Detroit. People survived on potatoes, crackers, or dandelion weeds. Some rummaged through trash cans looking for food. Many lived in shanty towns coined as Hoovervilles. They slept with Hoover blankets, or also known as newspapers, and they advertised their unemployment by turning their pockets inside out as Hoover flags. In a 1932 confrontation between workers and security forces at the Ford Motor Company's Giant River Rouge factory outside Detroit, 5 workers were left dead and some 50 others severely wounded. It was reported that a photographer had his camera shot out of his hands when attempting to photograph the incident. In The Nation, it was said that in 1932, 1/6 of the nation was at risk of starvation. In New York, it was reported that there was no food at all in many African-American homes. A 10-year-old African-American girl, in fact, died in her classroom from starvation in Albany, New York. Minorities were the hardest hit by far. American unemployment was as high as 25%, but African-American unemployment reached 50% in 1932, which was astoundingly high. Black unemployment was 30 to 60% higher than whites throughout the Great Depression. Mexican Americans faced repatriation to Mexico out of fear that they would be harmed if caught working in the U.S. Mexican Americans working in the Southwest saw their wages fall from 35 cents an hour in 1929 to 14 cents by 1932. In the South, things went from hard to horrendous for many African Americans. Job security was non-existent, as white Southerners would routinely replace African American jobs that had been considered menial prior to the Great Depression, such as street cleaners, bellhops, and garbage collectors. In the South, a short-lived organization was formed in 1930 that caught fire called the Black Shirts. Their mantra was, "No jobs for niggers until every white man has a job." Now, what caused all of this suffering, what caused all of this starvation, all of this destituteness that occurred? It was the lack of a federal welfare system, a lack of unemployment compensation, and the fact that there was no Social Security. Now, these programs, which should be instituted later and that you'll learn about later, keeps the United States afloat and make sure that individuals that are in need, whether that be in need of food, in need of housing temporarily, at least that's the goal, temporarily, receive benefits so that they are not destitute, they are not without a home, they are not without food, they are not without a direction for employment or bettering themselves in any way. Now, there is no unemployment compensation. By unemployment compensation, there is compensation today if an employee, without due notice or reason or cause, is fired from his position. If the company, for example, goes under and the employee is fired, the federal government will compensate them for a short duration of time so that they can stay afloat and will not lose their home or have any other grander negative repercussions from that sudden unexpected job loss. Now, that was not existent in the 1930s, so when somebody would lose their job, they would have no compensation, and they would go from barely surviving on their wages to not surviving on any wages. And of course, Social Security would keep those individuals that were elderly afloat, that were no longer working, that could no longer work because of their age. And in the Great Depression, many of them sadly died from the starvation. The elderly were some of the first to go during the Great Depression for a number of causes and a number of reasons. And that it really would have assisted them and their families if they had been able to receive some kind of Social Security benefit. Now, many feared that capitalism and democracy were failing the nation at this time period because there was no relief. And these fears of revolution were felt by many, and the Communist Party had gathered many followers by 1932. And when the Soviet Union announced its need for skilled workers in 1932, 100,000 Americans applied. What does that tell you? What does that tell us about the mood of this nation? That if Americans are clamoring to apply for jobs in the Soviet Union, what does that tell us about how people felt about capitalism and democracy in terms of their long-term success or their greatness? Over 1 million men took the roads and rails, destitute and searching for work in this period. And all of the nation was bathed in uncertainty. People did not know if and when the economy would improve. They did not know if and when they would have food. They did not know what job they could have, what job they would never have. The the entire nation was uncertain. The entire nation was up in arms in many ways, wanting change but not knowing where it would come from and how it would change. And because of all these factors, people would put off marriage, and the suicide rate was the highest, in fact, it has ever been in this nation. The birth rate was the lowest it has ever been. And the American people were truly traumatized. Again, out of work, hungry, and idle, the American masses did all they could to preserve themselves and their families. And they required some type of action, whether it be government action, whether it be who knows what kind of action that they were waiting for, hoping for. But they knew that action was required, action that was beyond themselves. And that, of course, would come later on with the New Deal and the policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, and we'll learn about those in the next section. But for this period, people were completely unsure and completely without direction. So on that note, I think we'll end our lecture for today. If you have any questions regarding this lecture, please write them down. I'd very much like to answer them. I'm aware that school is being canceled because of all this weather, so we're going to have to keep on going, pushing through however long it takes here, and I'm sure we'll get through it. So again, if you have any questions, have any comments, concerns about this lesson or about this topic, please do not hesitate to record them and provide them to me, and I would love to learn more about this issue with you and address any comments or questions you might have. So stay warm and stay safe.